Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this CECAN webinar on inequality in a context of climate crisis after COVID, the role of applied social science. My name's Ian Christie. I'm one of the co-investigators in the CECAN network. If you don't know about CECAN, we are the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity across the Nexus. And for the past few years, we've been applying complex systems thinking to policy design and evaluation, especially in relation to various aspects of environmental policy. There's a wealth of information about the CECAN programme at our website, and I do encourage you to have a look at all of the resources there. That's at cecan.ac.uk. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar, latest in our regular series. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor David Byrne. David is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Applied Social Science at Durham University. He's been a pioneering thinker about complex systems analysis, about methodologies such as qualitative comparative analysis, and about inequality. And all of these themes come together in his latest book on inequality in a context of climate crisis after COVID. And if you've not seen it, there it is, well worth a read. And David's going to be speaking to the themes of that book. David will speak for about 45 minutes, and we'll then have 15 minutes for question and answer. There is a Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Please use that to submit questions, and we'll keep tabs on those. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available on the CECAN website, cecan.ac.uk. So David, it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Thank you very much for speaking for us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I am going to start my screen sharing. And I'm going to give you an advance warning. I did something not unlike this, although somewhat different, for an Italian audience about a couple of months ago, and was accurately accused of being terribly pessimistic, right? And I think I am. I have to say quite honestly, I am, although given that it was an Italian audience, I could in fact, of course, reference Gramsci and say that's what required this pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, okay? And I hope we might maybe develop some optimism of the will. Right, this is a quotation from a very interesting science fiction writer, Octavia Butler, who was a Black American working class woman brought up in Pasadena. She's dead now, she died quite young, but her books are extremely interesting. And I like what she calls her way of thinking about what we're dealing with now. Notice she talks about climate, economic, and sociological crises. Now I have to say, on my reading of New Scientist, which I've been reading for very nearly now 60 years since I started reading it in the sixth form common room at grammar school, we have another one, which is a chemical crisis. And that I think is just as bad in some respects. But she talks about the pox as a slow world war, an installment part, World War III. This was a book written in 1998. That's nearly 25 years ago. She's talking about increasing inequality. She's talking about education becoming more and more privilege of the rich. And given the implications, I mean, if I look at my generation, I know that in the UK, of course, there was actually more social mobility because of the role of the grammar schools. And this would be true even in the generation of my older daughter, who's now in her early 50s. Not the grammar schools then, but actually a comprehensive school system that was working pretty well. So I'll be referring again to the idea of near future science fiction being a source of information for us, but I'll go on now. This is an image which I borrowed from my colleague Jill Callaghan, who is the co-author of the book we've written on complexity in the social sciences, the state of the art. We were writing the second edition and we wanted a sufficiently apocalyptic image. And this is actually a photograph of the sky in Berwickshire, in the southeast of Scotland, taken from Jill's house, which is literally, it's called Castle Rock, and it's literally on a rock sticking out into the sea. So she is someone for whom global warming is, let's say, an ever-present issue. And Storm Arwen, which did no more to me than destroy one of my summer houses, did a good deal of damage to her house. This is a book I found very, very useful. Lieven is a former professor of war studies, and he writes about climate change and the nation state. And in some ways, I'm wholly persuaded by his argument. Although I'll return to the role of international organizations, Lieven says it's nation states that have to avert climate change, that have to act. And the fundamental problem is the lack of motivation and mobilization of elites all over the world, although there are interestingly signs of that mobilization in China. And on the basis of my conversations with the Chinese students that I earned my living teaching for the last 5 years of my career, I think it's air pollution and the consequences of urban air pollution, which are driving a lot of that, and of voters in the West. Right? We have to have meaningful action, lack of motivation and mobilization by elites, and lack of engagement by voters in the West. Because Lieven says the level of necessary sacrifices by ordinary people will require sacrifices on the scale of those imposed on the UK civilian population during the Second World War, and can only be demanded as part of a system of national solidarity in which the rich have to pay their fair share, and in which the state guarantees the basic living standards of the population as a whole through social welfare and universal healthcare. What was the welfare capitalism of what Eric Hobsbawm called the fortunate third quarter of the 20th century? And he was right to do so. This was the era of my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. And it was a very, very different world in the UK then. This is the cover of the book. And I fiddled with it to produce the most apocalyptic possible image that I could from it. And thanks again to Lisa for making me put images into this presentation instead of just pure text. And I think it conveys rather well the implications of inequality. That was just a stock image that came free, but it worked very nicely. This, I think, is a very, very interesting slide. It's from the World Inequality Report 2022. And I think what is interesting about it is to look at the way in which within-country inequality globally is now at the same level as it was in 1920. We've reversed the general tendency. In many ways, a good thing, because the good thing about globalization, which has had enormous impact in when I was an undergraduate student, and even when I was a young lecturer, we used to call the advanced industrialized countries, and we should now call them post-industrial countries. It's been associated with increasing inequality within them, but it has actually eliminated, to a very considerable degree, absolute poverty on a global scale. It's the interesting places are not just the high-income countries, which are only 14% of the world's population, but high middle-income countries, one of which, of course, is China, and low middle-income countries, with India tipping on the balance to move from low middle to high middle-income countries. These are enormously important places for anything to happen in relation to the issues I'm talking about. So I'm going to say something about why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I've written a lot about inequality. I wrote a book on social exclusion in the 1990s. And I was rather, put it like this, the big commission on inequality that's running currently in the UK, chaired by a Nobel Prize winning economist who actually comes from Wycombe, the Scottish border is about 15 miles away from where I live now. I looked at what they were doing and I thought, I thought, third way, right? I didn't like it very much, okay? And I thought there needed to be something which took a harder and actually harsher view of what was going on. And that's what I tried to do in the book Ian mentioned at the beginning. So my method, right, it's complexity framed. That's essential. I work within the complex realism frame of reference, written a lot about that. Reid and Harvey's brilliant article of the early 1990s sets out exactly what that is. Non-equilibric, far from equilibric, complex systems with causal powers running in all directions. The best philosopher writing about this is my late friend, Paul Cilliers, who wrote incredibly well about the philosophical and ontological implications of complexity. Everything is dynamic, systems change their states, although much of the time they stay in much the same state. To use it as a metaphor, we can say they stay in a torus attractor. They just run around changing a bit, but being basically the same kind of thing. The historical term for that would be what the Annales School of History in France called longue durée. But when they do change, it's a radical reconfiguration. It's a change of kind, like the change from industrial to post-industrial societies, which has been characteristic of what happened during my adult life. And I'm the first in 4 generations of my family never to have worked down a Durham coal mine, although my father's sojourn in Harton Pit was relatively brief and relatively incompetent, and his life was transformed by the Second World War. The other thing I do is interpretive synthesis. This is not anything like the kind of stuff which is done in healthcare. It's really read as much as possible in academic and grey literature. I always worry if I spelled that rightly, because everybody whose surname around here is G-R-A-Y, but never mind. And synthesize what is found in the complexity frame. And I cannot emphasize strongly enough the significance and importance of grey literature. I mean, I don't know if we count OECD reports as grey literature, but I'm struck by the value of the reports coming out presently in relation to lots of these issues from the OECD, which I used to regard as one of the high priests of neoliberal capitalism. And even more by much of the material produced by the McKinsey Institute. And if there is any head high priest of McKinsey neoliberal capitalism, it was the McKinsey firm and their influence on lots of things. But the stuff coming out of the McKinsey Institute on these issues, the stuff coming out of the OECD, even the IMF, is very, very useful, along with national and other products. Remember what a crisis is. It's something which goes back to Greek medicine. It's got a 2,400-year history. It describes what happens in an infectious disease when antibiotics were not available, or when they again become unavailable. One of my best friends, somebody I've known for more than 60 years, Emeritus Professor of Clinical Microbiology at UCL, has spent a long career worrying and writing about the problem of antibiotic resistance. In that kind of infectious disease, either the person's immune system overcame the disease and they got better, or the disease overcame the immune system and they died. The crisis is a state which cannot continue. If you've got that kind of disease, let's say smallpox, which had a mortality rate of about 60%, you either got better or you died, but you couldn't stay just having smallpox. And the idea of crisis, I think, is a very useful one. And we're experiencing on a global scale interwoven crises of the social and the natural, which must lead to a transformation in the present form of the Capitalocene. And that, I think, is a really useful word. The Capitalocene is not just the Anthropocene. There's no doubt that human beings were making enormous differences to the natural world. Certainly, even when we were hunter-gatherers. Absolutely. After the agricultural revolution, which was, what, 6,000 years ago? But it's the Capitalocene which has drawn on fossil energy in the form of coal and oil, which is having the biggest impact. And it's the Capitalocene because the logic of capitalism is continued accumulation and growth. There are some links which take you to the writers about the Capitalocene, many of whom are followers of Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems approach to things. And I think they write persuasively about this. And I will say this, I'm largely the descendant of very poor Irish immigrants fleeing the famine in the 1840s, coming to the northeast of England to work in industrial capitalism, originally as coal miners. My great-grandfather Patrick Gannon and his brothers were among the navvies who built the enormous piers which turned the dangerous port of Tyne into the harbour of refuge on the east coast, and was central to the whole development of coal shipping on an even bigger scale and shipbuilding, and then subsequent engineering industries which derived from them. So, you know, the history of my family in this region is a history of the impact of the Capitalism. And am I glad that I live in the world that they created, that the Capitalism created, and I'm not living as a poverty-stricken peasant in an Irish bog where half my family have died? I bloody well am. But that is still the source of the problems that we face at this point in time today. So we have a path-dependent possibility space. Possibility space is a description of the range of possible conditions for the development forward of a complex system. It's not infinite, but it is multiple. Path dependency is the social scientific assertion that the future of a social, and by implication, interaction of social and natural system, is limited by the historical development of that system. What's happened in the past determines what the range of possibilities in the future. There are multiple, not infinite limited possibilities for the future development of the social system we have now. Although Friedrich von Hayek is a very clear and interesting writer, and certainly anybody interested in these issues should read him, not least his well thought out discussion in the essay he presented when he was awarded the so-called Nobel Prize in Economics. The Mount Pelerin Society's conception of complexity asserts that futures are noble. The social is generated solely by micro-emergent actions of multiple actors, mainly entrepreneurs through markets, and the planning for a desired future is bad. This is ideological nonsense. And Karl Popper, again, a man with a great deal of interesting things to say, is just as bad. If we start from a careful post-disciplinary consideration of the present state of our interwoven social and natural global systems, then we can imagine, and imagination matters, possible futures. Careful synthesis, and let's look at good near future science fiction. I drew on that a lot. The other thing I'm going to say, because I've been doing a lot of work on this in recent years, actually stimulated by my younger daughter's mother, who insisted that I should be working on this issue. The crucial importance of the interwoven systems of taxation, cash benefits, and income and kind. There's a lovely quote from Schumpeter saying, fiscal measures explain practically all major events, and in most periods they explain a great deal. And they have an enormous amount to do with the character of inequality in high, middle, and high income countries. They really matter enormously. And that's why I spent so much time trying to look at high middle income countries, primarily China and Brazil, in the book that Ian referenced. And here's a lovely quote from James O'Connor, who of course was the founder of real, in many ways, one of the founders of real ecological socialist work on these issues. Tax systems are simply particular forms of class systems. And they are, because tax and the redistributive effects of taxation and of the services which taxation finances in the form of the social wage in societies today are as important as the wage-labor relationship of classical Marxism. So here's a list of good scenarios, near future science fiction. I'm not going to go through them all, but I will commend, and I'll commend all of them. They're all wonderfully written and very, very well written. Octavia Butler, Cory Doctorow, Kim Stanley Robinson, who I'm delighted to discover is a member of Democratic Socialists of America, being as I'm redder than the fires of hell. But I particularly commend The Ministry for the Future, which is a very optimistic book about international interventions to confront the issues we face. The themes, Butler's social collapse and community-based reconstruction, not in the least surprising and entirely correctly, there's an emphasis on dispossessed minorities, but on joint working to move forward possibly. Robinson writes about, Robinson's almost the C.P. Snow in some respects of this kind of thing. He writes about the civil service in Washington, the science-led civil service. He's optimistic because the president in his book is a Vietnam veteran who is very radical, California senator, and is so engaged with the real science-led confrontation of global warming that he actually marries his principal science advice. Okay? There's also, in the book set farther in the future, a post-warming community confrontation with real estate capitalism. And I cannot emphasize enough the significance of real estate capitalism in relation to the issues that we face. Real estate capitalism is now the dominant form of capitalism in all high-income countries and increasingly so in all high middle-income countries. Dr. O is very into state and capitalist surveillance. He takes up the issue of the mechanization and computer base of production so that the kind of things that people used to do are now done by machines. And these machines are still owned by capitalism, but sometimes people break into the factories and set up a communist party where they just turn all the machines on and then steal everything that's there. There's a bottom-up social uprising and consequent transformation. But as the most pessimistic of these, and I'm afraid that I think Octavia is the woman who has the right view on these things, but there we go. I've been interested in action research. I was looking at it. I've been interested in action research since I wrote an MSc dissertation on this topic in 1970 when I was an MSc student of social policy and planning at the MSc. I worked on the notorious community development projects of the 1970s, where we developed a technique of feedback action research, which I think is what we need now. I've always been impressed by Pat Devine's book, Democracy and Economic Planning, the Political Economy of a Self-Governing Society, particularly by his discussion of the experience of the organization of the UK economy and society during the Second World War, although we must remember always that this was an organization of an industrial society. And it was not a centrally planned economy, but it was a planned economy with very large elements of participation, the co-production committees between unions and industrialists across industry. I think we'll have to think that the mode of governance should be participatory and dialogical. Dialogue gives expertise its proper status. And we need something like structure plans at a city region basis in the UK and the equivalent elsewhere, alongside national and devolved governance equivalents. I think city regions are extremely important, so long as they have both resources and power to do the things that need doing. I'm referring to structure plans because I realize as I move into old age, having just passed the age of 75, that there are not that many advantages, apart from the bus pass, I have to say. But one of them is having had lived experience of earlier periods. And the older I get, the more I warm to Harold Wilson and his government's efforts to reform the governance structure of the United Kingdom. I think Wilson was an extremely able man who had a very good understanding of the significance and importance of governance. And he was backed up by political giants, people like, oh, come on, the red-haired woman, come on. It'll come back to me, but I'll think on in a minute, okay?
Barbara Castle.
Barbara Castle, thank you, right? What a person to forget, okay, yeah. You know, I spent a lot of time demonstrating fiercely against the Vietnam War, partly on moral grounds, but also because at the age of 21, I did not want to be called up, and with A-levels in maths and physics, I would have been put as a second lieutenant in the Royal Artillery, and the second lieutenants of the Royal Artillery are forward observers. So if we had got involved in Vietnam, I would have a life expectancy of about 6 weeks. So I was very pleased to stay out of that. So this is just telling you what structure plans are. They were Written statements, illustrated diagrammatically, wonderful, of the local planning authorities and proposals for change on a large scale, right? On a large scale. And I'll come back to that with reference to the 2070 Commission, right? Which I think, really made the same point and made it well. And that's just a very good description. If you want to know what structure plans were, look at that article in Urban Studies in 1979, right? But the plan was intended to include all relevant activities of all agencies, including private companies, nationalized industries, central governments, and households, as well as those in the local authority itself. Analysis and reasoned justification, the likely future availability of resources. Very, very sensible stuff. Very much in line with Geddes' line: plan, survey, plan, and implement. The foundation of urban planning. This is an illustration of, it's a very fuzzy illustration, it's the best I could do, and it's of the report of the 2020 committee. And I emphasize its assertion: make no little plans, acting at a scale for a fairer and stronger future, right? Now, I've spent a lot of time looking at unity development plans in the UK, mainly in my long-term role, my major hobby as a troublemaker, right? And I have to say that, for example, the current unitary development plans for Newcastle and Gateshead, where I lived for many years in Gateshead, are really little plans. And where I live now, there's a major plan for the southeast of Scotland. And in many respects, it's quite an interesting plan, but it is not a plan, despite rhetoric, for a fairer and stronger future. It is exactly right in terms of scale. The southeast of Scotland doesn't correspond to a single local authority. It cuts Fife in half, which makes sense because the fourth facing half of Clyde is part of the southeast of Scotland, whereas the Tay facing part of Fife is part of the Tayside region. But this, I think, I always get his name wrong. Bob Kerslake, I think I've got it right. Lord Bob Kerslake was the chair of this. He's a man who was head of the UK civil service, but started off in local government. And I think that's a rather interesting thing about him. He was actually, I think, a maths graduate and a local government accountant. And I think he had exactly the right commitment there. This is the epigraph to the report. Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir the blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high, great ideas will never die, but live long with ever-growing urgency. I sincerely hope that's true, and I sincerely hope that's what happens. So let me move into the final element, which is really where I'm talking to you and what you do about what you're going to do in the future, because I'm 75, health teeth. This is over to you, kids, right? I've always been very interested in and informed by the work of Paulo Freire, the great radical educational philosopher, the Brazilian radical educational philosopher, exiled by the Brazilian military government, worked in Chile and was chased out by Pinochet, worked for the World Council of Churches. One particular thing I liked about Freire was when he had a visiting chair at Harvard, he was horrified to find that postgraduate students were given sections of books to read and insisted they should read the whole bloody book if they wanted to understand it. But he defines praxis, which is a term going right back to Athenian philosophy at its highlight, at its highest point, as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. It's not enough to study, you have to act to create a more just world. Praxis is a central defining feature of human life and a necessary condition of freedom. And it's how we express our human nature. And in a sense, it's what Marx was saying in the Thesis 11 on Feuerbach, I'll go back one, which is carved on his tomb in Highgate Cemetery. My oldest child, when she was 7 years old and very, very good reader, we were visiting Highgate Cemetery, and she read this and she said, The philosophers have described the world. The point, however, and she should have said, is to change it. But she misread the last bit and said, is to chance it. Right? And I always thought Jane came across a profound truth when she said that. Have a go. Okay. This is an image I wanted to put in because it's yet another crisis. I mean, when the governor of the Bank of England is saying we're facing with world food price crisis, and by God, don't you say it. And it's a nice image, which I pinched from the Independent. I think it shows what's actually going on. Something is happening. For me, at the minute, being somebody with a very adequate and comfortable pension, the thing that I've noticed is the increase first in fuel, but also an increase in birdseed, which is a relatively minor matter, although not for the birds I feed in my garden. But for other people on marginal incomes, and for a long time I was a volunteer in the Citizens Advice Bureau here in the Borders, and saw the extreme marginality of many people's lives in what is a relatively prosperous part of the UK, the Scottish Borders, how they were actually living right on the edge and a little knock could take them over. I think the crisis in terms of the cost of living is one of the most evident sources of how we think about things today. And of course, that's associated with the Ukrainian war, with the breakdown of the global world order. My partner often expresses the view that the safest period in world history was probably during when Reagan was president of the United States of America, at least from a European point of view, I have to say. And oh, come on, another one I've forgotten. Not Gorbachev. Oh, yeah. But the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was also a very elderly man. And both of them were in bed by 6 o'clock at night. And that was a very safe period in European history. Not in world history, but in European history. So I'm talking, really, Freire places a lot of emphasis on the role of intellectuals, as does Gramsci. And Freire is often interpreted, I think, simplistically, as saying that when we're doing anything, we have to take account of the people in the context in which we're doing it. Participatory research, we have to listen to them. Of course we do. But he also places an emphasis on dialogue. He says everybody teaches and everybody learns, right? And I think this is one of the things that I'm really interested in talking about. One of the things I really liked about CECAN was the engagement it gave me with people in the analytical professions of the civil service, that's economists, social researchers, statisticians, operational researchers, and with people who were working in consultancies in relation to the requirements of the UK civil service to find out things that it needed to know. Examples, particular examples, would be the entire engagement that CECAN had with DEFRA in relation to flood management. And flood management is a consequence, among other things, of the Capitano scene. It's not just that we have a changing climate regime. It's also that land is managed in a way which is contradictory to handling floods. I was for many years a very keen hill walker, and I saw, the disappearance of peat bogs in the North Pennines as the land was managed in a different way, wholly logical from the point of view of the economic interests of the farmers, but actually eliminating the ability of those peat bogs to act as a water storage. And the massive floods that happened in Cockermouth and Carlisle were a consequence in very large part exactly of that, right? So I'm interested in the role of people like many of the people who've been good enough to sign up for this webinar, the people who are working in governments. I'm putting a responsibility of praxis on you, and I'm going to straight away say it's not easy. Given the nature of contemporary governance in many countries and the short-term character of political processes, I think in principle, in governance where the political system is based on some kind of proportional representation and you have coalitions necessarily, things are much better. I'm going to commend in particular Welsh governance here, where the introduction of the principle of the interests of future generations seems to me to, at least in principle, and I hope in practice, to be of enormous significance. And I'm going to say very rude things about the characteristics of devolved Scottish governance, where despite the presence of the Green Party in government at this point, everything revolves around the national question, independence, and the second referendum. Now, I'm going to say bluntly that so far as the issues we are concerned with, the establishment of an independent Scotland, which I think would be on a neoliberal basis anyhow, is about as relevant as moving around the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic as the ship sailed into the iceberg. It's not easy, given the still considerable dominance of neoliberalism political attitudes by elites, although it's very much on the back foot in economics as a discipline, not least given the upsurge by the students and the complaints they are exercising about what they are taught. My oldest daughter did economics at Manchester in the early 1990s, the most neoliberal place she could have gone. The city suited her very well. She's a miserable northern person, and Manchester was just right for her. But it was only Pat Devine and Wendy Olson, who were very much out of tune with the neoliberal dominance, who gave her anything she thought was worth having. It's not easy, given that new public sector management is not yet dead. And new public sector management is a dreadful problem in relation to these issues, not least the audit culture. How glad I am that I was a professor before the audit culture really got going. But we're in a state of intellect crisis. Back to it. Crisis, the state of a system which cannot continue, must be transformed into a new state. Milton Friedman, one of the great bogeymen of neoliberalism, but he said something very sensible there. He said, never waste a good crisis, because it's in crisis when change has to happen that change becomes possible. Antonio Gramsci, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. God, look at the world as it is now. The re-emergence of really quite complex populisms. It's often a great mistake to call these populisms right-wing. In Poland, this place where I worked for a long time in the 1990s and the early 2000s in Katowice, looking at the deindustrialization of that enormously important industrial region. Law and Justice is not in any simple way a right-wing party. It's certainly illiberal on all kinds of issues in relation to gender and abortion and sexual identities. But in every other respect, it's very collectivist. It's introduced a very generous system of child benefits. It's raised the minimum wage in Poland substantially. It is very friendly to trade unions. So there's a complicated thing going on. If you look at Orban in Hungary, it's a very different matter. And if you look at the kind of populism that exists in the United States of America, it's a very different matter. But it's a complex relationship. Come back to this, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, right? If we're going to do anything about this, we have something that has to be done. We have to start pushing these lines. It's interesting. One of the people in this webinar, Karina, and I were talking about methods yesterday. And we got into a denunciation of the current character of UK sociology. And I think we were absolutely right. Sociology used to be quite often about, at least in formal terms, speaking truth to power, right? But it's become so fragmented, so much a little bit of this and a little bit of that in terms of particular things that people do, that the big structural ways of thinking don't work. Having said that, saying the right things, knowing the right things, look at the World Climate Summits, does not create change. the Green Party in Scotland is about as much use as a chocolate fire guard in doing anything about real change. It got rid of its only radical MSP, Andy Whiteman, and the whole farrago around gender identity politics. It's difficult to see what the political forces are, except that there's hope in intergenerational change. And that's why I am so keen on the Welsh legislation, on the interests of future generations. I have children in 2 generations. And while the older one was able to establish a life of ontological security, relative comfort, not that different from the one I have, my youngest child, who's in the mid-20s, is faced with the prospect of never being able to afford to buy a house until I drop dead. And given that she lives in Vancouver, which is an extremely expensive place to live, even my death will probably not provide her with adequate resources to achieve that standard of living. And I think that the young are beginning to realize this is one of the things that the OECD have written about very intelligently. A very, very good report on the squeezed middle. That middle income people like me, or even the generation of my daughter born in 1970, are looking at a situation in which, first of all, they're being squeezed themselves, although largely because we own our houses outright, are in a very good situation because we have the real income from the imputed rents of that ownership, something I'm obsessed about, but is interesting. But what we're certainly finding extraordinarily difficult is to pass on the comparable level of security to our own children, right? Many of the people I went to medical school with, and I have to say that my abandonment of medicine was a medicine for an enormous number of patients. I would have been the worst clinician on the face of the planet, were the children of manual workers. Don't find that now. That manual workers in the good years, the fortunate third quarter of the 20th century in high-income countries were able to pass on a lot of their benefits to their own children. I've seen this happen with my Chinese students, partly as a consequence of the thing which makes China such a complex society, the one-child policy, where people were able to concentrate resources on their only child. So, over to you. And I hope more optimism of the will from you to counter my pessimism of the intellect. I think I can stop talking now. Is that okay, Ian?
That's great. Thank you very much, David. Wonderful. Thanks so much. And the Q&A session is open now, so please do put your questions and comments for David into the Q&A box. And while we're waiting for that to fill up, I just want to ask a question of my own, David, having read the book with enormous interest. It seems to me that you're describing a situation of such complexity that policymakers are really at a loss to know how to cope with it. You document the increase in inequalities within countries, especially, particularly problematic within the rich world, where it does mean that mobility is being choked off in many respects and frustrations arising. You talk about the onset of climate change, which exacerbates many of those tensions. And you talk about the barriers to improvements in governance. And it does seem as though the complexity is potentially overwhelming for decision makers. Now we've got, as you point out in the book, OECD and other actors are becoming, despite their neoliberal heritage, pretty alarmed about this confluence of crises. And we can see in the UK an attempt to match up to it with strategies such as, or slogans such as Build Back Better and Levelling Up. Now these are attempts to at least begin to integrate action on inequalities and climate crisis into a post-COVID recovery. From your complexity perspective, how would you judge progress so far and the prospects for that sort of approach?
I think there are some countries where I think it's being done much better, right? I think in some respects, the Netherlands, partly because of the character of Netherlands governments, right? Multi-party collaboration and the relationship between the Netherlands academy and its governance systems is much more open to these kinds of things. And if you're Dutch, you're going to be concerned about global warming, right? Okay, it's a fact of life, okay? I think Wales is very interesting in this respect, because I think the principle of the interests of future generations, established as a legislative principle, right, is crucial. And it's absolutely characteristic that despite the fact that the Greens could have insisted on this as part of their entry into the Scottish government, they never even thought about it, yeah? But it's about governance. Governance matters. And one of the things that I think matters most is the forms of governance. This is why I really think that what we need is action research as a mode of governance, right? So participatory action research to involve everybody if possible. The structure plan, for example, for Tyne and Wear Metropolitan Council, as produced, was actually a very good document. It made lots of sense. It wasn't thinking about global warming at that point, but it was thinking about confronting the issues of deindustrialization. It was well put together. There was a whole process of multiple actors, including, I think, quite genuine consultations. I would refer as well to the Matthew Plan for the reconstruction of Middlesbrough, which was actually done during the Second World War and was based on massive consultation. Yeah? It was a really, really interesting document. It created a Middlesbrough in that fortunate third quarter of the 20th century, which was a really pretty good place to live in lots of ways, apart from the air pollution, which could dissolve the paint off your house, but that was another matter. But if you look at Teesside now, if you look at those estates that were created as good, decent places to work in East Middlesbrough, you see exactly the consequences of deindustrialization. So I think what I want to see is the idea of action research as the way you do governance, not just the way you do evaluation, not just the way you do social research, but action research as the way you do governance, which is why I place so much emphasis on the potential role of people like those in the analytical professions of the civil service, on the consultants, on planners in local government, on people who have this kind of planning and strategic role at any level within governance in terms of engagement. Frankly, I mean, one of the key places where it should be happening is in the health service, right? The health services of the UK, which are, I think, in a state of almost terminal crisis, precisely because there's something developed incrementally, but there has never, despite the fact that there were major reorganizations at various points in time, never been a kind of thinking of what is it that we really need when we have aging populations, when the majority of healthcare expenditure goes on aging populations, when the interface between health and social care, something we've been working on for years and years and years, right? And Phil Haynes, who's a complexity guru at the University of Brighton, has been writing about this since I examined his PhD, which was 20 years ago, right? And nothing really substantial happens, right? And that I think, is one of the big problems. The distraction of Brexit. I haven't quite got round to getting my Irish passport, although I'm entitled to it. But I think I will before too long. But I mean, in relation to these issues, it was an irrelevancy, but it was actually a signal about something I recognized very, very well, of the disillusionment of people with the political process. Yes. And I think the actions I've been involved in planning are often to do, for example, the Pathfinder program, which was demolishing working class people's houses in inner city areas of the north of England, right? And not giving them enough compensation to buy the houses that were built on the sites. The amount of anger that provoked, right, was marked contrast to when in the 1970s, where we were doing home improvement in the same areas. We were using general improvement area and housing action area policies to actually create home improvement. So, you know, it's how we do things as well as what we do.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. You've mentioned there the Welsh Act on the Wellbeing of Future Generations. So if people don't know about that, that was passed a few years ago by the Welsh government. And There's now a Welsh Futures Commissioner who oversees that Act's operations, and a bill was introduced in the UK Parliament to establish that as a principle in the UK as a whole. So it's worth following the progress of that kind of discussion. So thank you for mentioning that. There's an interesting question in the chat from James Derbyshire. Thank you, James, for this. James asks, are we better off emphasizing climate change's certainty or its fundamental uncertainty because of all the complexity associated with it, in order to get people and governments to change their behavior in radical ways? Now, you emphasize in the book, David, the potential scale of sacrifices required if we take climate action seriously. So in order to motivate ourselves, are we better off emphasizing certainty or fundamental uncertainty from a complexity lens?
Yeah, that's a really good question, James. I think, let me answer it. I live currently in the Scottish borders in Berwickshire, in what's called the Berwickshire Moors, which is a very rich agricultural area, right? And several of the people in this village are farmers or retired farmers with whom I'm on very friendly terms. And nearly 60 years ago, when I was a student in Newcastle University, I got a job working as a harvest hand on a farm. I loved it. I mean, everybody says you want to be, if you're ever a farm neighbor, harvest is the best time for two reasons. First of all, you're out in the open air and it's usually quite good weather. Second, you make loads of overtime and you get lots of money. Okay, so that's the good time to be a farm neighbor. So I've always been interested in it and like it and take notice. And everybody I know who's involved in agriculture in this region talks about change, right? And about big changes. Now, they're going to do very well this year because of the Ukrainian war, because the fields around here are full of rapeseed and barley, okay? And both of those are going to have premium prices in the consequences of the Ukrainian war and the impact on world food supplies, yeah? But I think we're sufficiently, this is the idea of possibility spaces existing as different possibilities, but seeing how far down the road you are in relation to one of them. There isn't a single farmer or farm worker or person working around agriculture that I know who doesn't talk about this, right? Who doesn't recognize big changes in the systems they're dealing with and faced with real crises. One thing they talk about constantly is the implications of the price of fertilizers and particularly potash, right? You know, that the reason we all have full bellies is because of capitalism's development of highly efficient fertilizers, which massively increase the productivity of croplands, yeah? So I don't think it's fundamental uncertainty. It is possibility, I think, is the word that we need to be using, right? That complexity is not about uncertainty. It's not chaos. It's about possibility. And that, I think, is the language that we need to use. But I think that's a great question, James.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, excellent.
Can we pick up the point about planning, which you came on to? I'm old enough to remember Harold Wilson and the planning systems of the 60s. And I agree with you that there is a kind of attractive confidence and social democratic vision of general betterment associated with those. But they did fall into disrepair because of a great deal of disillusionment with the outcomes of those planning systems that we had. And neoliberalism, which you've also invoked, is in many ways a fundamentally anti-planning ideology, which has still got a strong grip. How would you rehabilitate the idea of planning, given all of the problems that it was associated with in the 60s and 70s? And do you think that we're on the brink of meaningful subnational governance reforms to improve the status of planning in the UK?
Well, you see, I think, first of all, the planning that was discredited was not the kind of things that the structure planners were doing or the regional planners were doing, right? That operated at a different level. The planning that was discredited. There's a wonderful book by John Gallagher-Davies, who taught me briefly at Newcastle University, called The Evangelistic Bureaucrats, right? And it was mainly about urban renewal and slum clearance programs. And Norman Dennis, who also taught me, I think Norman Dennis, I think his was the evangelistic bureaucrats, but the two of them were presenting a very coherent critique of what was happening in terms of top-down planning, imposed particularly on working class communities, creating housing styles which, because they were not understood, did not work. As it happens, I mean, I've had a lot to do with high-rise housing over the years. It can work perfectly well if the lifts work, if you install resident caretakers, and if you put the right kind of households into it, right? Especially if it's got on public transport links. But things were done badly, which created at that level of planning. At the level, the structure plans were not command plans. This was not Stalinism. They were indicative planning, and you're right to say they were social democratic, but they were also modeled on the Gaullist indicative plans of the French system of planning, right? And I think that that was the interesting thing about them, that there was, nobody's turned around and said, for example, the Time-Year Structure Plan, there was an enormous area that had belonged to what was then the Time Improvement Commission at the mouth of the Port of Tyne, right? The Time-Year Structure Plan said this is no longer used as a coal dock because we're not exporting coal anymore. The largest cargo ever to come into the Tyne was a cargo of coal mined in Wyoming and transported from New Orleans, right? But we can use this. It's a really strategic deep water site with the enormous benefits of the Tyne Improvement Commission, right? Which turned the River Tyne, which could be waded across at the mouth, into a deep sea river that you could float a battleship 15 miles upriver. Okay? This is a wonderful site for all sorts of things. Yeah? And it must be reserved for strategic industrial uses. And you could just see that site as being a perfect site for the construction of offshore wind facilities. Yeah? And what's on it? Housing, a water park, and a shopping centre which sells seconds, you know, an outlet centre. And I think, you know, everybody said, that's absurd. Yeah? It's the quickest return on the capital value of the land because the land was handed over to the Time-Year Development Corporation, right? Appalling organisation. And that's what happened to it. And the local people, far from seeing that as, you know, but that was imposed on them. There was nothing you could do. There was no alternative, Tina. And I think that it's that level of planning which is most important. And I don't think that level of planning was discredited, but it wasn't much talked about. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we're coming to the close. We've got time for one more if anyone wants to throw something into the chat or into the Q&A. Otherwise, I have one final question which I'd like to put to you, David, for a quick response, which is that you've been with the CECAN programme from the start. And how optimistic are you now that complexity thinking, complexity perspectives and literacy is getting embedded properly in policy making?
Well, I'm very struck. I mean, CECAN, I think the relationship with DEFRA has been very, very positive, right? The relationship with the environment agencies has been very, very positive. Yeah. I think some of the other areas hasn't, none of it's bad, but it hasn't gone to that extraordinarily positive area. But one of the things I find particularly interesting about CECAN is that CECAN itself and CECAN graduates, right, are entering into the field of public health, yeah, and into the field of health systems. So there's a kind of carryover into those areas. And we see the same thing. I refer particularly to the Netherlands and to work coming out of Erasmus University. I think some of the people in Wizard, which is another very good thing in Wales, the Welsh Institute of Social and Economic Research and Development, yeah, are thinking in this kind of way. And CECAN has been very, very valuable, not in terms of transforming the ontological basis of complexity, but of taking the ideas and damn well putting them to work, right? And honestly, I apart from the CDPs, and the CDPs I was involved in when I was in my mid to late 20s, I can't think of anything I've enjoyed more.
That's a great moment to end on. Thank you very much, David. That's been such a rich presentation. I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it, and you'll be getting a virtual round of applause on all sides, I'm sure. Do have a look at David's book, Inequality in a Context of Climate Crisis After COVID. It's a terrific read, very, very informative about inequality, very provocative about the governance changes we might need if we take a complex realist approach to these interweaving challenges which David has been setting out for us. So David, great to see you. Thanks so much for taking part. Thank you to everyone else for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the day, and watch out for the recording and the presentation slides at cecan.ac.uk. And we'll see you again for another seminar in the CECAN series. Thanks very much for joining us, and goodbye.